The morning they discharged me, it was raining. Not the gentle kind of rain that makes you want to sit by a window with coffee. It was the hard, indifferent kind, the kind that doesn't care what you're going through. I stood under the hospital awning in a paper-thin jacket, holding a plastic bag with my medications, my phone charger, and a get-well card nobody had signed, and I called my son. It went straight to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I sent a text. The little bubble showed delivered. Then nothing. I was 63 years old. I had just spent 11 days in Mercy General after a stroke that paralyzed the left side of my face and left my left hand shaking like a leaf in a windstorm. The neurologist, Dr. Patel, had told me I was lucky that another hour and I might not have walked out at all. I had physical therapy twice a day. I had relearned how to button my shirt. I had cried in a hospital bathroom 3 times when no one was looking, not because I was afraid of dying, but because I was afraid of what came after going home alone, managing alone, being alone. And now I was standing in the rain with a plastic bag, and my son wasn't answering. I want to be fair to my son. I want to tell this story the right way, because he is still my son, and some part of me will love him until I stop breathing. His name is Derek. He is 34 years old. He works in finance in Charlotte, drives a nice car, lives in a house with a 3-car garage. He is not a bad person. He became someone I didn't always recognize. But he is not a bad person. His wife, though, that's a different conversation. I'll get to her. I stood under that awning for 20 minutes before I went back inside and asked the discharge nurse if I could use a phone book. She looked at me the way young people look at you when you ask for something they consider ancient history, then handed me her own phone and helped me search for a cab. The ride home cost me $42 I was not prepared to spend. I sat in the back seat watching the highway go by and trying to remember the last time Derek had called me first, without me calling him. I couldn't remember. My name is Raymond. I grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina, the son of a man who repaired appliances and a woman who cleaned houses. We didn't have money, but we had consistency dinner at 6, church on Sunday, and the understanding that you showed up for people. That was the rule in our house. You showed up. No matter what else was going on in your life, you showed up. I spent 26 years as a high school shop teacher at Jefferson High. Wood shop, metal shop, basic electrical. I taught hundreds of kids how to build something with their hands, how to measure twice and cut once, how to take something broken and make it whole. I wasn't a rich man. I drove a used Ford pickup for 16 years. I packed my lunch. I coached the junior varsity baseball team on weekends for no extra pay because the school couldn't afford another coach, and I didn't want the kids to go without. My wife, Carol, died when Derek was 12. Breast cancer. It was fast, and it was brutal, and it took everything I had just to keep standing upright. I raised Derek alone after that, cooked his meals, went to his games, helped him with homework I only half understood by the time he hit high school. I saved for 10 years so he could go to NC State without debt. I don't say any of this to ask for a medal. I say it because I want you to understand what it felt like. Standing in that rain, calling my son after a stroke, and hearing voicemail. The cab dropped me at my house, a small, 2-bedroom ranch in Clemens that I'd owned for 22 years. The rain had soaked through my jacket. I fumbled with my keys for a full minute because my left hand still wasn't right, and when I finally got inside, I sat down on the couch and didn't move for a long time. My neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Patterson, knocked on my door that evening with a container of chicken soup. She had heard from the woman across the street, who had heard from someone at the pharmacy, that I'd been in the hospital. That's small-town life. Word moves through it like water through a cracked foundation. I ate the soup. I took my medications. I went to bed, and I lay there in the dark thinking about Derek, trying to figure out when we had started losing each other. It happened slowly. That's the way it usually happens, not a single door slamming, but 100 small doors, each one closing a little more quietly than the last. Derek met his wife, Kristen, at 27. She was from a wealthy family in Raleigh, the kind of family where everyone went to private school and drove European cars and talked about real estate at dinner. She wasn't unkind exactly, but she was. Evaluating, Every time she looked at me, I felt like I was being appraised, like a piece of furniture she wasn't sure matched the rest of the room. Things shifted after they got married. Derek stopped calling as often. Our visits became shorter. When I came to Charlotte for Thanksgiving the year before, Kristen spent most of the meal talking about a trip to Portugal they were planning, and Derek smiled and nodded and passed the bread and barely looked at me. I drove home 3 hours in the dark, feeling like a guest who'd overstayed a welcome I hadn't quite been given in the first place. 6 months before the stroke, Derek told me he and Kristen were thinking about simplifying their relationships. He used that phrase, simplifying their relationships, like he was describing a budget. He said they wanted to focus on people who brought positive energy into their lives. He said this gently, carefully, in the way people say things when they've been workshopped into something that sounds kind but isn't. I told him I understood. I didn't understand. I understood nothing about it. I found out later from Derek's cousin, my nephew Marcus, that Kristen had told Derek I was emotionally draining, that my phone calls stressed him out, that I needed too much. I had called my son twice a week for 30 years. That was apparently too much. After the stroke, in the hospital, I sent Derek a text the second day. Simple. Just, had a stroke. I'm at Mercy General, room 417. He responded 6 hours later with, "Oh my God, Dad, are you okay?" And then, when I replied explaining what had happened, there was silence for 2 days. No calls, no visit, just silence. On day 5, I tried calling. Voicemail. Day 7, voicemail. Day 9, a text came through. "Dad, I've been dealing with a lot at work. I'm glad you're getting better. We'll talk when you're home." That was it. That was the full weight of my son's response to his father having a stroke. I didn't respond to that text. I didn't trust what I would say. So I came home to an empty house. I relearned how to navigate my own kitchen with a hand that trembled. I went to outpatient physical therapy 3 times a week at a clinic 6 miles away. Mrs. Patterson drove me when I couldn't drive myself, which was often. I ate a lot of soup and watched a lot of baseball and tried not to think too hard about what the future looked like. Then, about 3 weeks after I got home, I got a call from Jefferson High. The assistant principal, a young woman named Mrs. Torres, told me they were holding a retirement recognition event for several long-term teachers. She said my name had come up, that people still talked about my shop class, that former students had asked about me. She wanted to know if I'd be willing to come and say a few words. I almost said no. My face still drooped slightly on the left side. My hand still shook when I was tired. I didn't feel like standing up in front of people. But something made me say yes. I think it was the alternative, sitting alone on that couch, watching the light change on the living room wall, and waiting for a phone that wouldn't ring. The event was on a Thursday night in the school gymnasium. There were folding chairs and a microphone and a sheet cake that said, "Thank you for everything," in blue frosting. About 60 people came, current teachers, some retired ones, parents, and a scattering of former students who were now fully grown adults with their own children. I was standing near the punch bowl, wearing a tie I hadn't worn in 4 years, when a man walked up to me. He was tall, silver-haired, well-dressed in the particular way of people who no longer need to think about it. He looked to be in his mid-50s, though he carried himself like someone younger. He was looking at me the way you look at someone when you're not quite sure, when you're running a face through years of memory trying to find a match. He said, "Mr. Raymond?" Only my students called me that. Not Mr. Carter, not Raymond. Mr. Raymond, the way kids shorten things, make them their own. I said, "That's me." He said, "I don't know if you remember me. I was in your shop class. Fall of 1994. Spring of 1995. He paused. "My name is Calvin Webb." I looked at him. Calvin Webb. I turned the name over, and then, like something surfacing from deep water, I saw it, a skinny 15-year-old with oversized glasses and a broken voice and hands that had never held a chisel, who had come to my class angry at everything and everyone, and had slowly, over the course of 2 semesters, learned how to make a bookshelf. I said, "Calvin Webb, you built the maple bookshelf." His face broke into something I can only describe as relief, like he'd been holding his breath for 30 years. "You remember the bookshelf," he said. "I remember you never sanded the back panel because you said nobody would see it," I said. "And I made you do it again." He laughed. It was a genuine laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere real. "You told me the work you do when no one's watching is the most important work you do. I've thought about that almost every week for 30 years. We shook hands. We talked. He told me he had left Greensboro after high school, gotten a degree in electrical engineering, started a company in Raleigh that did infrastructure consulting for municipalities. I didn't fully understand what that meant, but I understood it had been successful. He asked about me, about retirement, about my health. I was honest. I told him about the stroke, about the hand, about coming home alone. I didn't tell him about Derek. I don't know why. Maybe I wasn't ready yet to say it out loud to someone who admired me. He listened carefully. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you still living in the house on Whitmore Drive?" I said yes. He nodded slowly, the way people do when they're deciding something. He said, "I want to give you my card. I mean it, I want you to call me, not out of obligation, because I'm in the area often, and I'd like to have dinner, catch up properly." He paused. "And if you need anything, rides to therapy, help around the house, anything at all, I want you to ask me." I took the card the way you take things when you don't plan to use them, with a polite smile and a quiet intention to leave it in a drawer. But 2 days later, my truck wouldn't start. I had a physical therapy appointment at 9 in the morning, and Mrs. Patterson was in Raleigh visiting her daughter. I looked at the card on the kitchen counter for about 10 minutes. Then I called the number. Calvin picked up on the second ring. He was at my house in 20 minutes. He drove me to therapy, waited in the parking lot reading on his phone, and drove me home. He didn't make it feel like a favor. He talked about baseball. He asked me about the shop class curriculum. He made it feel, somehow, like the most natural thing in the world, like we'd been doing this for years. After that, it became a kind of routine. Not every week, but regularly. He'd call on a Tuesday and ask if I needed anything in town. He'd stop by on a Saturday with food, real food, not soup, actual meals from a place he liked in downtown Raleigh. We sat on my porch and talked about baseball and local politics and the state of public schools and whatever was on our minds. I started telling him about Derek. It came out slowly, the way things do when you trust someone. I told him about the stroke, about the voicemails, about the text that said we'd talk when I was home, and then nothing, even when I was home. I told him about Kristen and the word simplifying and what Marcus had told me. I told him about Thanksgiving and the bread and feeling like a piece of furniture. Calvin listened to all of it without rushing me. Then he said, "Have you told Derek how you feel? Not angry, not accusing, just directly told him it hurt you?" I said I hadn't. I said I was afraid of what would happen if I did. He said, "What are you afraid of?" I said, "I'm afraid he'll tell me it's over, that I've already lost him and I just don't know it yet." Calvin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mr. Raymond, I spent 3 years not speaking to my father. When he died, I had about 4 days worth of things I needed to say and no one to say them to. I'm not telling you what to do, but I know what the other road looks like." I thought about that for a long time after he left. The following week, I called Derek. Not a text, a call. He picked up, which surprised me. His voice was cautious, the way it gets when he's bracing for something. I said, "I'm not calling to fight. I'm not calling to make you feel guilty. I just need to say something, and I need you to hear it." He said, "Okay." I said, "I had a stroke. It was serious. I was in the hospital for 11 days. I called you and I texted you and you didn't come, and when I got home, I was alone. I don't know what's going on between us, and I don't know how much of it is things I did wrong, but I need you to know that what happened hurt me in a way I haven't been able to shake. That's all. That's what I called to say." There was a long silence. Then Derek said, in a voice I hadn't heard from him in years, small, uncertain, like a much younger version of himself, "Dad, I know. I've been trying not to think about it because thinking about it is too hard." I said, "Hard for you?" He said, "That's not what I meant. I said, I know what you meant. We didn't fix anything that night, but we kept talking. 10 minutes became 40. He didn't mention Kristen. I didn't mention Kristen. We talked about the stroke, about my hand, about physical therapy, about what the doctor had said about long-term recovery. At some point, Derek's voice got thick and he said, I should have come, Dad. I know I should have come. I don't have a good reason. I wasn't thinking straight. I said, I know. I didn't tell him it was okay, because it wasn't okay. Not entirely. But I told him I wasn't calling to prosecute him. I told him I just needed him to know I was still here, and I needed to know he knew it. He said he'd come visit. He said the following weekend. He came, without Kristen. He pulled up on a Saturday morning in that nice car and stood on my porch, and I opened the door, and for a moment we just looked at each other. This man who used to fall asleep in my lap watching baseball games, who used to call me from college just to talk about nothing, who I had raised from a 12-year-old boy with a broken heart, and I saw something in his face that looked a lot like shame. I said, Come in. I'll make coffee. We spent the whole day together. We didn't resolve everything you don't resolve 30 years of accumulated hurt in a single Saturday, but we talked honestly, more honestly than we had in years. He told me things about his marriage that I hadn't known, that it was under strain, that he and Kristen were in counseling, that he felt pulled between two different versions of who he was supposed to be. He cried once, in the kitchen, with his back to me, and I put my hand on his shoulder and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say. I told him about Calvin. He didn't know what to make of it at first. His 63-year-old father, who had spent the past years slowly disappearing, had apparently made a genuine friend, a former student who showed up with meals and drove him to physical therapy and sat on the porch talking baseball. Derek looked at me with something between surprise and something else I couldn't quite name. I said, he was in my shop class in 1994. He built a maple bookshelf and tried to skip sanding the back panel. Derek said, Did you make him redo it? I said, Of course I did. He laughed, and for a moment he looked like himself again, like my son, the one I remembered. A few months after that Saturday, Calvin called me with something on his mind. I could tell from his voice the careful way he was choosing words. He said, I want to ask you something, and I need you to know there's no pressure and no obligation involved whatsoever. I said, All right. He said, I'm expanding the company. I'm opening a training division, basically a program for young people who want to work in trades and infrastructure but don't have access to formal education or tools. A lot of them are coming out of rough situations, aging out of foster care, that kind of thing. He paused. I'm looking for someone to run the workshop component, someone who knows how to teach young people with their hands, someone who knows how to reach kids who've given up. I said nothing for a moment. He said, You taught me that the work you do when no one's watching matters. I want to build a program around that idea. I want you to be the person who teaches it. I said, Calvin, I'm 63. I had a stroke. My hand still shakes when I'm tired. He said, I know. I've also watched you build a shelf unit in your garage with that hand because I could see you through the window one afternoon and I didn't want to interrupt. A pause. The shaking doesn't stop you. It just slows you down a little, which, in a teaching environment, might actually be an advantage. I didn't say yes that day. I sat with it for a week. I talked to Calvin about the details, the location, a facility in Raleigh. He was converting. The students, 16 to 24, most of them from disadvantaged backgrounds. The schedule, 3 days a week, which my doctor had already said was fine for my recovery. I talked to Mrs. Patterson, who told me to stop thinking about it and just do it. I talked to Derek, who was quiet for a moment and then said, Dad, that's exactly what you should be doing. So I said yes. I started in January, on a cold Tuesday morning, in a workshop that smelled like fresh lumber and machine oil, and reminded me of every good thing about the 30 years I'd spent teaching. My first class had 9 students, 2 young women, 7 young men. Most of them looked at me the way Calvin had once looked at me, wary, assessing, not sure yet whether this was going to be worth their time. I stood at the front of the room and said, My name is Mr. Raymond. Some of you will build something this semester that you're genuinely proud of. Some of you will build something you think is terrible. Either way, when you're done, I'm going to make you sand the back panel." A girl in the front row said, "Why?" I said, "Because the work you do when no one's watching is the most important work you do." She looked at me for a moment, then wrote it down. By the end of that first semester, 3 students had built furniture pieces that Calvin displayed in the company's lobby. One young man, 19 years old, had been couch surfing since he was 17, built a dining table out of reclaimed oak that brought the entire room to a standstill the first time someone saw it. He stood next to it at the end of semester showcase, with his hands in his pockets, trying not to look proud, failing completely. I knew that look. I had seen it on Calvin Webb's face 30 years ago, standing next to a maple bookshelf. Derek came to the showcase. He shook Calvin's hand and stood in the workshop looking around at everything with wide eyes, like he was seeing something he hadn't expected to find. On the drive home, he called me from his car. He said, "Dad." I said, "Yeah." He said, "I'm proud of you." I had to clear my throat before I could answer. I said, "Thank you, son." There was a pause. He said, "I'm sorry. For the hospital. For all of it. I know I keep saying it, and I know it doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know I mean it." I said, "I know you do." He said, "Kristen and I are separating. I think it's been a long time coming. I don't want to talk about it yet, but I want you to know." I said, "I'm here, whenever you're ready." He said, I know you are. I won't tell you that everything became perfect after that, because it didn't. Derek's marriage ending was painful for him, and I watched it from a distance, available when he reached out, not pushing when he didn't. He moved to a smaller apartment in Charlotte, started calling more often. We had dinner together once a month, sometimes twice. It wasn't the relationship we'd had when he was young, and maybe it never would be exactly that again. But it was real. It was honest. It was 2 people choosing each other without the weight of obligation making the choice for them. My left hand still shakes when I'm tired. My face has mostly recovered. You can barely see the droop now, unless you're looking for it. I drive myself to appointments. I work 3 days a week in the workshop in Raleigh, with students who are slowly, stubbornly, learning to trust their own hands. Calvin and I have dinner on the last Friday of every month at a barbecue place in Greensboro that's been there since before either of us can remember. We sit in a booth by the window and talk about the program, about baseball, about whatever's on our minds. He asked me once, about 6 months into everything, whether I ever thought about how different things might have been if I'd never gone to that event, if I'd left his card in the drawer like I intended to. I said I thought about it sometimes. I said I thought it was the kind of thing you could drive yourself crazy with, if you let yourself. He said, "The night I walked into that gymnasium, I had told myself it was just a courtesy appearance. I wasn't even going to stay for the speeches. And then I saw you standing by the punch bowl in that tie, and I thought, he looks exactly the same." He shook his head. "You changed my life, Mr. Raymond. I don't mean that as a compliment. I mean it as a fact. When I was 15 years old and angry at everything, you made me sand the back of a bookshelf I didn't want to make. That simple, stubborn insistence that the work mattered, it became the foundation I built everything on. I just wanted to find a way to give some of that back." I looked out the window at the parking lot for a moment. Then I said, "You know what I remember about you in that class? Not the bookshelf, not the sanding. I remember that every other kid in the room would quit when something went wrong. They'd put the tool down and wait for me to come fix it. You never did. You'd sit there with the thing in your hands, staring at it, for 10, 15 minutes sometimes, just refusing to accept that it was broken." Calvin was quiet. I said, "I didn't teach you that. You came in with that. I just gave it somewhere to go." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he picked up his glass and said, "Same time next month?" I said, "Same time next month." Outside, the evening was settling over Greensboro, the way evenings do in that part of the country, slowly, warmly, without hurry. Somewhere across town, in a workshop that smelled like oak and machine oil, 9 students were learning that the work you do when no one's watching is the most important work you do. And in a barbecue place on a street I'd been driving down my whole life, 2 men sat in a booth by the window, not needing to say much, having already said what mattered. That's the thing about showing up. You never know what it will set in motion. You never know whose whole life pivots on a single moment of somebody refusing to look away. My father taught me to show up. I taught a skinny 15-year-old with oversized glasses to do the same. He grew up and showed up for me when I needed it most. The circle doesn't break. It just keeps moving, outward, long after you stop watching.